What are the differences between interfaces and abstract classes in Java? Welcome, Java Challenger. By learning the principles of this video, you're going to be able to design better Java code, which means code that it's easier to add new features and fix bugs. Okay, so now let's explore the main differences in this mind map. So let's start with interfaces. So the first thing to keep in mind is that interfaces are a contract. It basically represents what a class must do, but it doesn't say how a class should do that. So for example, if we have two methods in an interface and we have another class implementing this interface, we must implement those two methods. The other important feature added in Java 8 is that now we can use default methods. So those methods, they are public, they can be reused, they have default behavior, and they can be used by classes that implement the interface as well. So this was very useful, for example, when the functional interfaces were added in Java, and also the stream API. Adding those default methods helped a lot. And even though those methods, they have implementation, they are different than abstract classes because the default methods can't have any state, which means that an interface can't have instance variables. The other detail about interfaces is that it doesn't have constructors, which means that you can't pass any variables or any state to your interface when you are instantiating the class that implements your interface. An interface also allows multiple inheritance, which means that if you want to implement several interfaces, you are okay. It's totally fine to do that. The other detail, as I mentioned before, an interface can't have state, but it can have instead public, static, and final fields, which means that they are only constants. The state can't be changed at all. Interfaces are also useful to share common contracts between classes and use polymorphism. So a good example of that is the list interface, because you can instantiate the list interface with array list or linked list or vector. So interfaces are really useful to use polymorphism. The other important difference is that a class implements an interface. So remember this keyword. Default methods are not mandatory to be implemented by subclasses. So default methods are a common behavior for the interface. And I will reinforce that default methods can't use instance variables. It can't hold any state. So I'm saying that because many developers thought that interfaces would be like abstract classes after the default method feature was added. But the crucial difference here is that default methods can't have any state. It can't hold any state. Remember that. And the other thing we can do with interfaces, we can create functional interfaces. For example, the runnable interface is a functional interface, or the supplier interface, the predicate interface. So in simple words, functional interfaces are interfaces that have only one method. Okay, so now let's explore what we can do with abstract classes. So the main difference between abstract class and interfaces is that an abstract class shares state and everything else with a subclass. As I said before, interfaces don't have state. It's impossible to add instance variables. We can only add constant variables on interfaces. Remember that. That's the most important difference between abstract classes and interfaces. Abstract classes can both have method with and without implementations. And the methods without implementations, it's mandatory to implement them in the subclass. With abstract classes, there is no multiple inheritance, which means that you can only extend one abstract class. And like I said before, an abstract class can have instance variables, which means non-final, non-static, and with any visibility, public, default, private or protected. It's also useful to use abstract classes when we want to use common functionality, while we want also to force abstract methods to be implemented. So with abstract classes, we can have methods with implementation, but we can also have abstract methods, which means methods without the implementation, only the contract, only the method signature. And the other fundamental difference is that a class extends an abstract class. Instead of using the word implement, we use extend. Okay, so now let's go to the fun part. Let's go to the code. Okay, let's start exploring interfaces. As you can see here, we have this constant, and notice that this is not an instance variable, which means that you can't change this variable at all. Once you assign a value to this variable, it can't be changed. And the other detail is that even though we didn't put here the keyword final, behind the scenes, it's actually public static final. So remember that even though we are omitting this information here, an interface will always have public static final constant field. And here, notice that we have two methods without implementation. So this is the contract of this interface, and this is the default method. And notice here that we can't use an instance variable within this method. And the default method can also be overridden, and it's always public. On top of that, we can also add static methods. So this is useful if we don't want to create an implementation of this interface, and we can simply invoke this method only by mentioning the interface plus method. Basically, we don't need an instance to invoke this method, which could be useful. And in Java 9, the feature of having a private method was added because sometimes we would have repetition in the default method. So instead of repeating code, interfaces now allow private methods. So we can reuse it within the default method, for example. Because as you can see here, we are already invoking this log action method. And it's also useful for readability because then you can easily see what's going on here. So private methods is useful to use within default methods. And since the static method is static, it doesn't have an implementation, we can't invoke the log action method. So it's only for default methods. Remember that? And let's see the implementation now of this interface. So we have the smartphone class, which implements electronic device. And we have a very simple implementation here. We are just printing a message. And notice here that we are overriding the default method. That's totally fine because the default method is public, and if we want to override its functionality, it's totally fine. And the other detail is that those methods, so we have to implement them, otherwise we're going to have a compilation error. So when I mention that an interface is a contract, it means that whenever you implement this interface, it's mandatory to implement both methods. Otherwise, your code won't compile. So if we uncomment that, then it's all fine. So now let's see how we can use the interface. So notice that we are declaring this myPhone variable with electric device, and we are instantiating with smartphone. Why? Because smartphone implements this interface. And from the interface, we can invoke the turn-on method, turn-off method, and we can also invoke the reset method. And as we checked here, we are also overriding the reset method, which means that this is the message that will be printed. And as I said before, we can also invoke the static method without an implementation. Why? Because notice that we are using here the name of the interface. We are not using the instance. We are using the interface name plus method. So I can show you here again. This is a static method. And now let's run our code to see what happens. And as you can see here, we have the smartphone messages. And here we can check that our method that we overrode is here. So we are showing this message. And in the end, we are invoking the static method, which doesn't need an implementation. And another important detail about interface abstract methods is that even if you don't say it explicitly here, those methods, they are actually public abstract. If you put that here or not, those abstract methods under the scenes will be always public abstract. If we declare the method like public abstract, abstract void, or if we put whatever, it returns an int, returns int, behind the scenes, it will be the same as public abstract. So when we are declaring methods in an interface, we can just omit that because it's redundant. We don't need to say that those methods are public abstract because they will always be public abstract. And if we try to create a protected method in an interface, we're going to have a compilation error. It's the same for private. If we try that, we will also have compilation error. So an abstract method in an interface will be always public and abstract. Remember that. The other important difference between interfaces and abstract classes is that in an interface, we can create a functional interface. So what is a functional interface exactly? It's basically an interface that has only one abstract method, right? It's an interface that has only one method without implementation. And notice here that to make sure that the interface is functional, we can use this annotation. And if we try to add another method here, we're gonna have a compilation error. So this annotation is important to avoid having two methods here by mistake. So let's see how we would use that interface then. So with that interface, we can use a lambda expression. And this is basically an implementation of this method. So basically, instead of implementing this method here, which would be the same as that, we use the concept of functional programming and we implement this method compute here instead, right? So basically here what's going on is that we have an instance of Square and we implement the compute method. Then we invoke this compute method with 5 and it will return the square of 5. And the other examples of functional interfaces are supplier. So as you can see here, we are using generics and we have the get method. Those interfaces are vastly used with the streams API. So we also have predicate, which has only one abstract method. It's fine if you want to add a default method because a functional interface is an interface that can have only one abstract method. But default methods, you can have as many as you want, as you can see here. And you can also have static methods. It's totally fine. We also have the function interface. We have only one abstract method, some default methods. And we also have consumer, which has, again, only one abstract method and a default method. And the other thing we can do with interfaces is that if we want, we can extend another interface. So let's create here a copy of electronic device just for example purposes. And let's extend this interface here and it works fine. So basically this interface will inherit everything from this other interface. So we rarely will use this concept of interface extending another interface, but it's useful to know that this is possible. And here we can also extend as many interfaces as we want. So we could do that and so on. And in smartphone, if we want, we can also implement other interfaces. So remember that with interfaces, we can use multiple inheritance. Okay, so now let's explore an abstract class. Basically, an abstract class can do everything a normal class can do, but we can add abstract methods as well. In other words, methods that don't have implementation. And the other fundamental difference is that, like I said before, is that abstract classes can have state, which means that we can have instance variables. And we can also have constructor. So we can initialize whatever we want with our constructor. We can have public methods. We can have a final method as well, which means that it's a method that can't be overridden. And we can also use the template method design pattern, which means that we can invoke an abstract method here, another abstract method here, and do something in the middle. So now let's see the car class extending vehicle. So another important point is that a class can't extend more than one class. If we have here, for example, vehicle 2, and if we try to extend vehicle 2, we're going to have a compilation error. So that's another fundamental difference between abstract classes and interfaces, because with interfaces we can use multiple inheritance. We can implement more than one interface. So here we can have one more attribute, for example, and in this class we can pass this parameter to the superclass, which means that brand will be passed to our abstract class via constructor. The other important point is that abstract methods have to be implemented. If we comment this code, we're going to have a compilation error, similar to interfaces. There's another detail that with abstract classes, we can create a protected abstract method. The other important detail that is different from interfaces is that we can have a protected abstract method. We can also have a default abstract method, but we can't have a private method because it wouldn't make any sense, since we need to implement this method from an external class. So a private abstract method doesn't make any sense. That's why it doesn't compile and it doesn't work. So we have this method, which we have the implementation. And then if we want to override this method, it's totally fine. So we can see here, display brand of subclass car. So by invoking this method, display brand, we're going to see this message. So now let's see how this would work. So notice that we are declaring the variable myCar with the interface, and then we are instantiating with car. And we pass the brand and the fuel level. Here we invoke the operate vehicle method, which is the template method. And in the template method, it will invoke the start and the stop method. Here we're gonna get the fuel level, which is implemented here. And then we will invoke the concrete method we overrode, and we're gonna see the message from the car implementation. So as we can see here, we invoked our template method operate vehicle. And just to let you know, template method is a design pattern. I created an article about this specific design pattern, and I will leave this article in the description of this video. Okay, so let's go back here. So as you can see in the operate vehicle method, we invoke the start method, and then we're gonna print the message from car. So car is starting, then car is stopping. Then we're gonna have the message in the middle, which is vehicle is in operation, and then car is stopping. And here we get the fuel level. So in car, we also override this method and we return 50. Why? Because we are passing 50 here. Then we have the display brand method that we also override here in the car class. That's why we are showing display brand of subclass car. The other important detail about abstract classes is that we can't instantiate an abstract class. So if we try to do new vehicle, we're gonna have a compilation error. So we always need to have an implementation for an abstract class. So you might be wondering why abstract classes don't allow multiple inheritance. And that was a deliberate decision from the Java programming language engineers. And that's because in C++ there was the diamond issue. So I won't go deep into this issue, but just to let you know, in simple words, the diamond issue was the following. Let's suppose we had a superclass A, and this superclass A has the method do something. And the B and the C class, they override the do something method differently. And then what happens if they extend B and C? Then what method will be the right one? The method from B or C? This is good because that decreases the complexity of the Java programming language. It's not like C++ where you can use multiple inheritance, but your code won't be clear or very good. So it's best for us to avoid complexity and to make our code as simple as possible. Okay, so to recap, remember that interfaces are a contract and it doesn't have an implementation. Even though you can have default methods, they can't hold a state. They can't use instance variables. On the other hand, with abstract classes, you have all the capabilities of a normal class, but you can also use abstract methods. And also remember that in interfaces, you can use multiple inheritance. And with abstract classes, you can only extend one abstract class. Don't forget to support this channel by giving a like and getting subscribed, because then the YouTube algorithms will share this video with more Java developers, and then they're gonna be able to grow in their Java career and also to create better quality code so that they don't have stress when creating their code. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope it's clear the difference between interfaces and abstract classes. And I'll see you the next time.